So welcome to the 24th episode of the Religion in Praxis podcast. I'm your host, Tornike Metreveli. Today, I'm delighted to have Professor Oliver Scharbrodt from Lund University with us. Professor Scharbrodt's research explores Islam in historical and contemporary settings, from modern Islam, Reform to Shia Islam, Sufism, Islamic Messianism, and the experience of Muslims in Europe. His works makes a cutting-edge theories in religious studies deeply relevant to understanding of Islam today. With this in mind, we'll focus today on a controversial topic, the phenomenon of Quran burning in Sweden. While Sweden is hailed as a bastion of freedom of speech and tolerant society, it's also a multicultural meltpot with a substantial Muslim community. The burning of the Quran, Islam's holy book, by the far-right activists and other controversial figures raised complex ethical and legal questions. It is an act seen by many as an effort to religious freedom and tolerance, fueling community tensions and threatening Sweden's international standing even. There have been protests all over different parts of the world, different embassies of Sweden, and also it polarized Swedish society to a large extent. So, but where does the Swedish government stand in this dilemma? How does it reconcile the right to free speech with the need for religious tolerance and community cohesion? Today, we delve into these issues, discussing the historical context, the motivations, perhaps, of the far-right activists, and the societal implications of Quran burnings in Sweden. And this is a generally very relevant question to the European context, and we'll also examine the legal conundrums and the government stance on this sensitive issue. Professor Scharbrodt, welcome to Religion in Praxis.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
So how does this incident compare to historical cases of religious texts being desecrated both within and outside of Sweden? Can you give us a broader context for our listeners?
Well, I suppose the recent incidents are quite new because they stem from a particular political climate that we can observe across Europe. I mean, we see the rise of right-wing populism across Europe. We see this with the Sweden Democrats in Sweden as well, but we see this obviously across Europe with the increasing electoral success of right-wing parties and, if you like, the trickle-down effect of right-wing populist discourse within public debates across Europe. I mean, this is not just a Swedish problem. This is something we can observe across Europe. And one important element of this, right-wing populist phenomenon that we can observe across Europe is its anti-Islamic or Islamophobic stance, targeting in particular Muslim minorities, the Muslim presence in Europe, perceiving this as a threat to the cultural identity, the historical identities of European societies. So the recent incidents are very much or need to be understood and need to be placed in the context of an increasing normalization of Islamophobia across Europe, being pushed forward by right-wing political agendas. And again, it's no surprise that when the first who sort of began the more recent trend in Sweden, Rasmus Paludan, Swedish-Danish right-wing politician, began burning the Qurans in I think in early spring 2022, just a few months before the general elections in Sweden, to gain traction, to gain attention, and so on. So I think the more recent incident of Quran burnings in Sweden and similar incidents in other European countries, need to be contextualized, within the broader anti-Islamic climate, political climate that is created through right-wing populist parties. Now, when we look at similar instances in a kind of Christian context, or instances where Christian symbols, where the Bible is desecrated and so on, I think the motivation is slightly different. This is more, done by, secular groups, atheist groups, artists who do this to ascertain themselves that we live in a liberal secular context. You can attack Christianity, you can attack sacred symbols of Christianity. So when similar instances occurred within the Christian context in Europe in more recent history, or in the last sort of decades and so on, particularly around artistic productions and art that ridicules Christianity or that uses Christian symbols and subverts them, ridicules them, I think they occurred more from, I suppose, kind of an atheist, secular perspective, sort of to gain a sense, okay, we live in secular Europe. Christianity used to be culturally, politically influential and powerful historically, but we sort of overcome this, and therefore we can attack symbols of Christianity. So that's a slightly different motivations. It's more about sort of, challenging the kind of the Christian hegemony in European history, from a kind of secular atheist perspective, whereas the Quran burnings and the desecrations of the Quran are more driven from a sort of right-wing populist agenda to either gain traction for particular political actors or to create an overall political climate in these societies hostile to Islam.
And how is society responding to that? What's the Swedish society's response? And both.
Well, there are obviously a variety of responses. I think, of course, there might be people who support this because they share the sort of anti-Islamic agenda of parties like the Sweden Democrats. But I think for many people, it's seen, as a kind of embarrassment. I remember there was, somebody interviewed, in the course of these burnings, and which he said that, this is something un-Swedish. This is not something that we do in Sweden. Swedish society is a very consensual society. Everybody living and working in Sweden knows that as part of sort of Swedish culture, it's actually quite common to avoid conflict, to offend other people, to deal with conflicts that might occur, like in a professional context, in a personal context, in a way to avoid conflict, to find consensus if conflict occurs. So, I was quite intrigued when, this person in a kind of journalistic service said, well, this is very un-Swedish. This is not how we are not used to offending people. We're not really, that's not part of our culture, our tradition, to antagonize other people, to attack other people. So I think that's also kind of response that, this kind of confrontational stance, deliberately offending a particular community, that's not sort of part of Swedish culture. I think there are many people on the liberal and maybe left side of things a bit on the fence. And I've come across this in many conversations where people would say, particular colleagues in academia, all right, I can see this is offensive for Muslims and it's insulting for Muslims and so on, but, it's freedom of speech. That's part of our society, that is part of our political culture. So I think you have, a range of views from being embarrassed around this, seeing this sort of unnecessary, also a bit un-Swedish to be deliberately antagonistic. But I think there are also many intellectual academic people on the liberal left side of things who don't quite know how to respond to this because their inclination is, okay, it's offensive to Muslims, it's disrespectful, we're attacking a minority, it's part of a broader anti-Islamic discourse that is pushed forward by right-wing activists across Europe. So they're obviously not comfortable with that. But equally, they don't want to be perceived or want to be seen as individuals that seek to restrict freedom of expression. I think that is a dilemma that many people sort of within the liberal mainstream of Swedish society have at the moment.
And there's, of course, a normative question. So where do we draw the line between freedom of expression and respect for religious sentiments, especially, again, going back to this Quran burning incident in Sweden? So what should be the solution? I know academics, we hate to sort of go into the should questions rather than what is, why, and how questions. But for the sake of our audience, how shall the secular state deal on the one hand with this extremely existential, to an extent, even normative dilemma between freedom of expression and respect for religious sentiment?
Yes, that's obviously the big question, and I think I'll give sort of two answers to this. One is what I think will most probably happen, and the other thing, what I think should happen. I think what we will most likely see is either that the legal framework will be changed. We now see this in Denmark, where there is a new law going to be introduced that actually will ban the desacralization, the desecration of sacred scriptures, whether it's the Quran, whether it's the Bible, whether it's the Torah. So that's a step that the Danish government has been taking by sort of singling this out as a criminal offense and criminalizing this act. And I would imagine if this sort of drags on, and we have further incidents of Quran burnings in Sweden, and it creates all these major security measures of the police being involved, which of course are extremely, I mean, they need a huge number of resources in terms of human resources, in terms of financial resources, that something similar will happen, that some sort of legal change will be introduced that will make this as a criminal offense. Or alternatively, existing legal frameworks will be used to justify the banning of these Quran burnings by either saying this goes against public safety and security, so the police has discretionary authority to ban these events, and this happened a couple of times in recent times, that when individuals submitted an application to burn the Quran, that was rejected based on public security and safety. So I think that will probably be implemented more. Or alternatively, there will be more an effort to designate, to describe these Quran burnings as hate crimes, because there is hate crime legislation. If verbally I attack a particular community, a particular sexual, racial, ethnic, or religious community, and I spread hatred around this community, then I'm committing a criminal offense. So I think that's sort of what I'm expecting, that either existing legal frameworks will be used in order to try to control and limit these burnings, or new legislation will be introduced outlawing it, as we've seen in Denmark. So that's probably what I expect to happen. What I should happen, I think, in my view, this whole debate, is this covered by freedom of expression? Is this acceptable? Is a bit of a distraction. And I think it's a bit of a distraction to immunize these events against criticism. I mean, I mentioned some of my liberal colleagues they feel they're on the fence. They're not quite sure how they should position themselves, because they see the offensive character and the sort of the anti-Muslim character, the anti-Islamic character of these events. But of course, they also want to defend freedom of expression. But I think this is a bit of a distraction. I think the real debate that, in my view, needs to happen in Swedish society and across Europe is around how do we engage with Muslim minorities? What kind of place do we give them in European societies? And to what extent is it acceptable to undertake acts that are offensive to them? And I think this is really beyond legislation, beyond laws or the implementation of the law. This is more about social conventions. And we have learned it in relation to other minorities in terms of how we interact with them, the language you used. For example, I mean, 50, 60 years ago, it was normal and acceptable to use the N-word when we were referring to Africans or people of African background, African heritage. Now, nobody would do it. Nobody with decency would use the N-word in public or in private because it's seen as a racial slur. Now, there is no legislation banning anyone from using this word, but we have a social consensus that it is unacceptable to use this. Or when we talk about, sexual minorities, again, there were, in the past, a certain language was used in reference to members of the LGBTQ communities, in reference to people who are homosexual, where, it was acceptable to use certain terms in relation to them to characterize them in a particular way. And again, there are not necessarily laws banning the use of certain terms or certain discourses around these minorities, but we as a society have reached a consensus that we feel this is inappropriate, this is not acceptable. Again, political correctness is sometimes used, sometimes in a kind of disparaging sense, to characterize this particular attitude that, okay, we're dealing here with minorities who have been persecuted, who have been discriminated against, and we need to be particularly thoughtful in terms of how we address them, how we engage with them, and so on. And I think, we need to have a similar discourse around Muslim minorities, that it's not really about freedom of expression. It's about what kind of attitudes, what kind of relationship is acceptable when we deal with Muslim minorities. Because minorities, whether they're ethnic, sexual, religious, cultural, linguistic, are always vulnerable. Majorities usually know how to take care of themselves. I mean, we have human rights not to protect majorities, it's to protect minorities. That's the idea behind human rights. So I think there needs to be a debate. Okay, we have a new, significant, growing Muslim minority, new religious minority in a European context, in Sweden. How do we engage with this minority and things that are sensitive to them? And I think that's something that moves beyond legislation and a legal framework that relates more to social conventions, political correctness, the protection of minority rights, and becoming conscious of the needs of minorities. I think the second point, and there we come specifically to, if you like, the religious dimension of this debate. I think the major problem of Swedish society, and I think of European societies more generally, that we have lost to a very large extent our sensibility around religious matters. I think it's sometimes a lack of what we might call religious literacy. So sometimes it's sort of unawareness and lacking knowledge of religion. But I think it's also a result that we've come to terms with the place of religion in European societies. Yes, we are sort of cultural, secular Christians, do certain things, but religion is not something we really talk about. And of course, what we have now, with a growing number of Muslims living in European societies, we have the question of religion and the place and role of religion in the public sphere, in public life, being put back on the agenda. Something which we thought we ticked it, we put it in a drawer, we solved it, and it's sort of there, but we don't really address this. And I think, the new Islamic presence has put it back on the agenda. So again, there needs to be a broader debate about what is the place of religion in our societies? How do we deal with religious diversity, with religious pluralism? How do we deal with, particular sensibilities that religious communities have that might be specific to them and might not be shared with other communities? So that needs religious literacy, that needs an engagement with religious ideas and the religious worldviews of these minorities. So I think, it's a much broader debate. That's sort of really the point I want to make here. It's much more than just, a question of legislation and new laws. It's about how do we engage with a growing religious minority community, its particular needs, its particular sensitivities, in a society that has perceived itself as being secular, something where religion doesn't play a role. And now religion becomes important again.
Would you guide us through, especially briefly, given the context, and you're talking a lot about the structural dimensions of this problem, obviously, where many right-wing populists are kind of instrumentalizing the idea and element of fear that somebody's coming to take over with the culture and kind of the civilizational kind of protection of the civilizationism, if you will. We've seen it in the right-wing Christian narratives in Netherlands and Austria, as well as now we're seeing this party politics in Sweden, which are targeting particularly one religion in its rhetoric. I wonder how do migration and integration challenges intersect on both ends, and both and the recipient as well as you mentioned the structural part, what the state should do, and how the structural problems can shift in longue durée the problem of integration. I'm wondering what's the religious minorities' position, how and to what extent they're been feeling integrated, and how they are integrated in the Swedish community, and what's the process within this this debate of integration, migration in the context of Sweden. If you guide us through briefly of for a very general audience that is listening to us both across the ocean and in Europe, it'll be great.
I think the first point I'd like to make is that yes, right-wing populism targets, among many other groups, Muslims in particular at the moment. But I think if we didn't have such large Muslim minorities in Europe, if they were not existent or very, very small, they would target another group. I think, so that's, as you said, this kind of fear of civilizational integrity, of kind of purity, of homogeneity, and you have a minority community that is challenging this, people who are different. I think it just happened to be Muslims now because there are a growing, significant minority community, the most important minority community in a contemporary European context. But if they were not here, were another group, they would target them. So that's, I think, the first one. So I don't think it's something specific to Muslims. It's a more reflection of how in right-wing discourse that is concerned about purity, cultural purity, homogeneity, protecting us against them. The them could be anybody who is, perceived at that particular moment as a particular threat to sort of the homogeneity of the society. And in the current context in 2023, it just happens to be Muslims because of the significant role they play as the largest Muslim minorities. I think there are different issues coming here together. I mean, there is, on the one hand, of course, the need to, in very practical terms, to integrate, these migrant communities in particular who've come more recently into European societies. And that obviously requires educational support, that requires integration into the job market, that requires their overall socioeconomic integration within European societies. And there, I think, most governments have failed. I mean, they have either had sort of a very naive understanding, sort of, they can keep their culture and we support them and we'll all get along in one way or the other. So I think, there is a certain political naivety around multiculturalism as such. I think multiculturalism is a reality of European society. So in a kind of descriptive sense, we have to accept that we live in societies that are religiously, ethnically, and culturally plural. But, the kind of normative sense of multiculturalism, I agree, that's a bit naive to sort of assume everybody can keep their culture and, we support this and we sort of will manage to get along. So I think that's a problem. And I think there was also another problem, that sort of the notion, okay, we've sort of accepted these people in our countries. They will see how liberal and progressive we are, and we've been so generous in giving asylum and refuge to them. Surely they will embrace these values as well, and we become liberal and progressive as well. And of course, this is not necessarily happening. Yes, of course, many of these migrant communities embrace these values, but many of them have socially conservative values and so on. So I think in terms of the expectations of European host societies or governments, there has been a little bit of naivety on political and intellectual grounds, that it will be kind of a smooth ground, because it requires active effort of the host societies to integrate them, to avoid the segregation. And of course, if these opportunity structures are provided, then it will be easier for these minority communities to integrate. I mean, I think after when the Quran burnings began in Sweden, in spring 2022, and then after the more recent incident in Malmö, in southern Sweden, and the violence between certain groups and the police, I think there are, this is not primarily a kind of a sign of the offense certain communities feel about these actions or their frustration. I think it's an underlying frustration about their lacking place in Swedish society, in European societies. I mean, they've been segregated, they've been put in particular neighborhoods with poorer educational facilities, poorer healthcare, very little chances to progress economically, and that leads to sort of segregation, ghettoization, to the rise of criminality, the rise of criminal gangs, and so on. So it requires efforts on both sides to sort of integrate them, and I think the kind of socioeconomic integration plays here an important role, and an understanding that both minority communities and the host societies need to play an active role. At the same time, beyond this socioeconomic integration, there needs to be also a sense that Muslims and their particular worldviews, beliefs, and values have a place in Swedish society or in European societies more generally, even if they challenge certain secular assumptions that we've made about European societies, even if they potentially challenge liberal mainstream views around certain issues. So integration means here, on the one hand, sort of providing pathways for a kind of socioeconomic integration through education and the professional field within host societies, but also, again, changing the discursive parameters where people who challenge the kind of secular liberal mainstream are not automatically sort of marginalized or perceived as not being part of European societies.
Yeah, of course, for our listeners, the book that challenges the conventional wisdom that positions secularism as neutral or universal, instead revealing how it can be deeply intertwined with cultural and political and even religious assumptions, is Critique Secular, Blasphemy, Injury, and Free Speech by Talal Asad, Wendy Brown, Judith Butler, and Sabah Mahmoud. Great read, in case you're interested. And that brings me to the next question, actually, on how has the concept of blasphemy evolved within Islamic jurisprudence from the time of Prophet Muhammad to present day? I know that's a $1 million question for a 5 to 10 minute answer, but Islam is diverse with various sects and schools of thoughts. And are there differences in how blasphemy is perceived and dealt with across these different traditions? Would you guide us through that, or what's your take on that?
Yes, absolutely. It's a very diverse tradition, and not surprisingly, there are diversity of views around this issue at the same time, because we're talking here about a world religion of almost 1,500 years of history. 1.3 billion followers. Obviously, there's a range of views among Muslims, and of course within sort of scholarly traditions that have dealt with this issue. Now, the first problem that we encounter is that there is not really in Islamic thought, if you like, in Islamic law, that would primarily deal with these issues, or in Islamic theology, a real equivalent to blasphemy. The major concern for Muslim theologians, and then for Islamic lawyers, jurisprudence, legal scholars, was the question of, when does a Muslim become an apostate? So when do his actions or her actions, his or her words, signify that they are not really on the ground of Orthodox Islam? So when they what makes a Muslim an apostate, and what are the criteria? So that's the first thing we need to be aware of, that there is not really an Islamic discourse on blasphemy as such, but it's about apostasy and the conditions of apostasy. So what does a Muslim need to say in order to stop being Muslim, about God, about the Prophet, about the Quran, and so on. So the discourse is very much focused around, if you like, the expectations of a Muslim and his or her actions and words and views and how they're articulated. And again, it's not really about blasphemy. It's about when does it become unorthodox, when it becomes apostasy by saying, I don't believe in God, or, Muhammad is an imposter, the Quran is not the word of God, it's not a divine revelation, and all these sort of things, where I say, okay, you have different schools of thought, but these are things where different Muslim schools of thought address. So that's the first we need to be aware of how it is framed. It's about the question of apostasy, and it's primarily directing Muslims. And, you have different views. Some would say, okay, saying certain things doesn't necessarily constitute apostasy. It needs to be turned into actually political actions to undermine an Islamic state. Only then do we need to intervene. But if people just utter random opinions about God, about the Prophet, so that's sort of one debate. To what extent do you need to intervene as an Islamic authority if you come across views that are seen as heterodox, as heretical, as possibly constituting apostasy? So there's a difference between different legal schools, different legal scholars. Then there's a difference on the punishment. So some say, okay, the person needs to be put to death. Others say, no, we need to give the chance of the person to repent, or we imprison them. There's a difference of opinion if the perpetrator is a male or female, or other different punishments, and so on. And of course, these debates are not, specific to Islam. I mean, we have in Christianity and in pre-modern Christian Europe, we had the Inquisition, which was all there to ensure that Christians conform to particular notions of orthodoxy. And, Christians who are seen as heretical would equally be killed. And we had, witches that were burned. So I think, these debates around how to deal with somebody who is a heretic, who is an apostate, and the punishment, and how, if you like, religious authorities have to intervene, and how the state needs to support them, that's obviously a discourse that is not unique to Islam. That is, we find something similar in Christianity. Another important element or issue where there are different opinions is the question of to what extent do these rulings affect non-Muslims? Because, again, the way how this is framed in Islamic law is about when does a Muslim become a heretic, an apostate, and what should be the punishment, or what should be the sanctions that, society or Islamic authorities or the state need to impose. So the question is, how do these rules apply to non-Muslims? Because obviously there are not Muslims, they can't become apostates, and they would have beliefs that anyway would be heretical from an Islamic point of view. So Christians who lived under Muslim rule and their religion was sort of tolerated, they lived as minorities. Of course, they believed in the Trinity, which from an Islamic theological perspective is heretical. They believe that Jesus is the Son of God, which again, from an Islamic theological perspective, is heretical. They don't believe in the prophecy of Muhammad. They think he's an impostor, he's not a prophet. So already as part of the religious worldviews, they would hold views that are seen from an Islamic perspective heretical. And with few exceptions, religious authorities, state authorities didn't intervene. As long, of course, if these views were not present in the public. So again, there is a debate on, okay, if a non-Muslim in a Muslim context attacks God, attacks the Quran, attacks the Prophet, to what extent are the punishments or the sanctions that would apply to a Muslim, are they applicable to a non-Muslim? And again, you have different opinions. Some would say they can do whatever they want because they're non-Muslims anyway. And of others say, okay, they might not share these beliefs, but, we live in an Islamic order. This is an Islamic society. So we have a responsibility if people attack the foundations of Islam, even if they're not Muslims, we need to intervene and so on. And of course, these are all debates very much in the pre-modern Muslim context. So I'm talking here really about, if you like, debates among Islamic scholars in the pre-modern period. Now, the modern period has changed many things, and of course, you have again a variety of approaches in schools around this. I mean, you have people who maintain more traditional understandings, but of course, you also have, if you like, liberal, reformist Muslim thinkers who would say, okay, these rules emerged in the context, in the pre-modern context, in a particular situation, and they're not really applicable in the modern world. And therefore, we need to revise these traditional rulings and, give freedom of speech and so on. I mean, when we look in the contemporary context, the major targets of, these sort of charges of heresy, of blasphemy, of apostasy in Muslim majority context are usually Muslim academics, intellectuals themselves, who argue for a reinterpretation of Islam, a different understanding of the Quran. And of course, we might say this is part of a larger process to limit, kind of liberal thinking, progressive thinking in certain parts of the Muslim world where religious authority cooperate with autocratic rulers, dictatorships to limit the scope of freedom of speech. So yeah, we can certainly see a diversity of views around this, around what constitutes blasphemy, what constitutes apostasy, to the extent whether these rules that apply to Muslims apply to non-Muslims. There's a diversity of views. And there have been intense debates within modern Islam between, if you like, more conservative, traditional thinkers and more progressive liberal thinkers around the suitability of these ideas in the modern context.
Yeah, and great explanation for a very complex question. Thanks very much for that. I mean, obviously there are a number of questions, but we're running out of time, so a few more questions. Given the current global political climate and increasing polarization, what are the potential implications of incidents, as we discussed, like Quran burning in Sweden, and how can societies navigate these challenges in the future beyond Sweden and in general? We've spoken a lot about this normative frameworks, and perhaps the Danish example where we see that governments are ready to challenge legally, but also, as you discussed, there are some social and political, social / cultural elements to that on the level of society, which are imperative, and these are extremely important questions. I'm wondering what's the sort of potential implications in outside of Sweden for this Quran burnings. Do you see any chain reactions? Do you see any within Germany, for example, or other countries in Europe with a significant Muslim minority population? What kind of responses on both political and recipient end do those actions and incidents generate, and what should we expect in the future, if you can predict? Of course, with a very careful usage of the word "predict" here.
Well, I think I think what has happened, obviously, it has sort of created an awareness around these issues, and certainly, sort of creating an environment has created, other contexts, an environment where people are discouraged to do that if, existing legal frameworks would not prescribe such activities at the moment. So I think, I suppose there is a certain effort made to sort of present this as a particular sort of Swedish problem or specific Swedish issue because of its very broad definition of freedom of religion, and to sort of say, look, it's not happening in our societies. We have a better sort of understanding of the sensibilities of Muslim minorities, or we have existing frameworks that sort of prevent these sort of activities. I think, as I said, what we need is a more robust debate around how we deal with religious and cultural and ethnic diversity in our societies, how we relate to Islam, how we create an understanding of Islam that doesn't other Muslims, that sort of integrates them, that makes sure that they feel part of European societies. I think the challenge is that at the moment, the overall political climate is not very conducive for such an open debate, because we see the rise of right-wing populism across Europe. Political parties that are part of this particular political spectrum becoming more powerful, becoming part of governments, and so on. So I think that will be the challenge for academics, intellectuals, for leaders of different faith communities, Christian or majority communities or minority communities, how to instill, if you like, an ethos of mutual understanding of religious sensibilities, of respect for religion. How representatives of communities that have this sincere goal of increasing understanding in a political climate that becomes increasingly hostile to such sentiments. I think that will be, the major political challenge of European societies in the coming decades.
Thank you very much, Professor Scharbrodt. Thanks our listeners for joining us in this extremely enlightening journey, and we look forward to bringing you more engaging conversations with leading experts in future episodes of Religion in Praxis. Until then, take care and stay curious.